Thanks so much for the introduction, Gwen. And I am excited and honored to be moderating today's panel. As everyone here today paying attention, investors, audience members alike, making stuff contributes a lot to the global carbon footprint. Everything from buildings to fashion, one of the largest greenhouse contributors continues to be the way we make things across every sector, every industry. And today we are joined by three leaders of companies that are doing some pretty incredible work, innovative work in different spaces. And I'm excited to introduce them, and we'll just dive into what they're up to and what they're doing in their industries and their sectors to attack this problem and build some really cool pathways forward. So on our panel today, we've got Dr. Leah Ellis, CEO of Sublime Systems, which is an organization that's working to decarbonize cement making. We also have Alex Greenhalgh, CEO of Spintex, which is involved in making high-performance silk fibers without silkworms, which uses dramatically less energy. And we are also joined by Kevin Martin, co-founder and CTO at Unspun, which aims for zero waste and local production by making custom-fit denims. So, handling that side of demand as well as making standard sizes irrelevant. And with those really short descriptors, I'm certain our leaders here today will get us going by giving us a little bit more depth on just what you're up to and what your companies are doing. So why don't we start with Alex?
Yeah, no, thanks, Kevin. In regards to what we're doing at Spintex, Spintex was founded as a company to take inspiration from nature and apply it into textiles. In particular, our focus of our inspiration was the spider, which is probably the world's greatest textile producer, but it's also the most energy efficient producer of textiles. So in comparison to plastic fibers, it takes 1,000 times less energy to make a fiber the way a spider does compared to the traditional processing routes that we would take in polymer science. And really, at our core, what we did was to try and replicate this process to bring this energy efficiency to textiles in a way that hasn't been seen before.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And perhaps an appropriate segue would be to Kevin, just in terms of what you're doing at Unspun.
Yeah, so we probably similar to most folks here, started Unspun with a big climate mission, really thinking about the climate side effects of apparel, depending on who counts, one of the dirtiest industries. So Unspun exists to really focus on decentralizing and localizing and automating apparel manufacturing to the point where you could produce a product only once it's sold, rather than way ahead of time and need to carry a bunch of standing inventory, which turns out to be one of the biggest kind of like dead stock losses financially.
Great. And we're already seeing just the relevant areas all across the value chain, if you will, from the actual material to a more of a supply chain kind of impetus and effect. And last but not least, Leah, we went from the spider to macro here. So would love to hear a little bit more about Sublime.
Yes, Sublime is making carbon neutral cement. So as you may know, cement is responsible for 8% of global CO2 emissions. That's because we use more cement than any other material besides water. And each ton of cement results in a ton of CO2. So we're facing a problem as the world's population grows and becomes more urban. The floor space on Earth is expected to double in the next 40 years. But at the same time, we also have to be reducing our CO2 emissions if we want to mitigate climate change. So Sublime is developing new technology to make cement so that we can meet our sustainability goals while still continuing to build.
Thanks, Leah. And having spent some time in the public sector, I worked at the U.S. EPA during the Obama administration. At the time, we thought about the power sector as a big part of the problem, right? Here on this panel, we have companies and people focused on also large pieces of the puzzle that frankly aren't necessarily clearly attackable at, let's say, at federal regulatory scale, et cetera, which is what's both fascinating and frankly exciting when it comes to the movement. And so The reason I bring that up is I want to harp on something Kevin mentioned. Kevin, you laid out that presumption that we're all here in part because of that climate mission. I think that's an appropriate one to make, but I wanted to take that to both Alex and Leah and just ask a little bit about the impetus to start these companies. Clearly a decarbonization pathway is an output, right? But at the beginning of your ideation, and you're all scientists, which I want to get to in a second, but was the climate piece of this the key component, and how do you contemplate that at the stages that your companies are at now? So we'll start with Leah, and then we'll go around the room.
Yeah, the climate motivation was definitely first and foremost at the ideation stage. So I'm an electrochemist by training. My PhD is in lithium-ion batteries. And when I met my co-founder, we discussed ways to use our skills in electrochemistry to go beyond batteries. So how do we use electrochemistry to decarbonize the world's single biggest polluter outside of electricity, which is cement making? So for the motivation, it's like when you're working on such a big challenge, even if you could reduce cement's emissions by 10%, you would be having a terrific carbon impact. And that's one of the things that gets me up every day. It's like we can just chip away at this massive piece of the pie.
Well said. And Alex, 1,000 times is a lot in terms of energy savings, reduction, et cetera. So, pretty compelling stuff in theory, but it was the energy piece a big part of the why behind the company?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, when you look at the way that spiders produce their fibres, that low energy route to manufacturing it is a necessity for them. This is one of the principles behind the kind of biomimicry that interested us so much at the start. Is in nature you don't have easy access to energy. There aren't fossil fuels that could be used. That's a man-made approach to solving energy problems. In nature, everything has to be as efficient and as careful with its resources as possible. So many spiders will actually recycle their webs at the end of the day to spin a new one. There's zero waste going on. You have this circularity basically baked in from the very start. And I think that's always fascinated me. My background is in biology, so looking at biological solutions for problems has always appealed to me. And I know when we were first starting the company, there were all these different ideas. You sometimes have a technology which can go in so many different directions, and you're feeling out which are the most appreciable ones. But always from the start, this energy efficiency really started to guide us towards this end goal that we always had in mind of reducing this impact in textiles, because it's the manufacturing and the energy requirements there that's been one of the hardest things to solve so far.
Sure. And there's I definitely appreciate that perspective. And biomimicry often has done the centuries of innovation that is a shortcut
millions
for
of
us.
Years.
Yeah, exactly. And appreciate the way you articulated that. Kevin, thinking about what Alex just laid out, the supply chain is such an integral piece of, let's call, the broader textile puzzle, if you will. And that's definitely something that Unspun's attacking. And we'd just love to hear you go a little bit deeper on that and your perspective there, and just how that matters to your pathway forward.
Yeah, totally. I mean, whereas supply chain nerds used to kind of be more fringe for the last couple of years, it's now the whole world's seeing it. I bet everyone's grandma knows about how many boats are lined up outside LA. And the world's really seeing like what happens when a just-in-time manufacturing and supply chain process breaks. And so that's a big belief of us at Unspun is kind of generally this technological trend of decentralized systems to centralized back to decentralized. And grandma used to make the clothes, and then everything was manufactured, and within 100 square miles in Asia. And now the vision that we see is more in that same direction, like Alex mentioned, as much of the supply chain is localized and small production and efficient ultimately is really what it comes down to.
Sure. So before we get back to a little bit of a bigger picture and thinking about the industries and sectors and marketplace, I want to ask more on the personal side of the three of you who founded these companies as scientists with deep expertise in the areas that you have. I find that the audience that's listening into this conversation, from investors to other scientists to other founders, et cetera, this is if you think about the world 20 years ago, to have that kind of depth in science and research knowledge and expertise to really, let's say, take a risk and try to do this with your life, it's a different way to think about what to spend a lot of your blood, sweat, and tears doing. And I would earnestly just love the three of you to speak a little bit of that to your, personally. What brought you? Certainly, there's some things that brought you into the depth that you've studied, and what has now brought you into business building. Which is not maybe the conventional pathway for your peers.
Well, I can take that first. It was actually one of my professors in grad school, close to retirement, very grumpy and jaded as they often are. And she said, back in my day when people got PhDs, they were giving other people jobs. And kids these days graduate their PhDs and they want other people to give them jobs. And I took that to heart. And I think that one of the coolest things that you can do as a scientist is to invent things. And hopefully those things have economic merit. And you use that to give other people meaningful jobs. So that's really what brought me here.
That's great. That's great. And yep, Alex, why don't you take us down your thought process?
Yeah, no, I think the kind of biological side and what kind of ended up bringing me into the whole world of silk, I'd always been super interested in the kind of small parts in biology. I had a lot of interest in microbiology, virology. That's really where I kind of sunk my teeth in my early kind of biology studies. And then proteins are just even smaller than that. And particularly when you start getting into silk, you start to realize it's not just one discipline. It's a completely multidisciplinary area where you have to understand things from material science to chemistry to biology to the evolutionary background of the material you're working with and why it's evolved to be a certain way. And I think that kind of multidisciplinary side really appealed to me. I always wanted to know everything about everything. So the kind of academic side really responded to that. But then at the same time, I like to see physical things. I like to see something that's real, that's tangible. Obviously, you can write papers, but it's still very cerebral. You don't have something that you can give to someone and have them hold it in their hands. You can't see someone wearing your academic paper. And I think that was really the thing that kind of brought me into the kind of business aspect, was you can actually make something that, if it goes far enough, it can touch every single person on this planet and have a positive impact. Right. And I think everyone here is probably at the root cause looking to have a positive impact overall.
Right. That's something that I hear between the both of you. Leah, your note was on human impact as well, just in terms of presence in the world and what that means for others. And Alex, material impact is what you harped on towards the end there. Kevin, I want to give you a chance to give your perspective too. It's a very personal thing to spend years studying something and then decide to build a business because of it. So interested in your perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like if I'm going to wake up every day and spend all day on something, I fundamentally want that to be something that matters. Like why do anything? And for me, the need to address climate in a way that we can get the world to adopt now feels like one of the most important issues of my generation. I really like the analogy lately of suddenly COVID was a thing, and then how did we get people to start social distancing? Like it takes something happening fast for people to react, and climate change is reacting and happening slowly. And so it's almost like boiling the frog slowly from the beginning, where the world doesn't realize that in 20 years it's going to be a number one priority, but the solutions are going to need to be worked on now. So how do we make that happen, and how do we find those overlaps? So that's really what motivated me.
I, for one, am very thankful that folks like yourselves are not the frog that's waiting to jump out. That actually gets to a good point. Alex, you mentioned it as well, and just knowing how deeply you all have thought about your sectors. Let's talk about impact. let's talk about that large chunk of greenhouse gas output, but specifically in the way that you're thinking about it in your sectors, textile, cement. We talked a little bit about it, but let's say 10, 20 years from now, there's a maturity timeline that is going to be different based on the three companies here that are represented. What does that impact look like? And talk to me a little bit too about just broadly, sectorally, are there going to be many other players? Will there be consolidation in the space? That piece is an interesting kind of momentum building relevant component that certainly you all have thought about in terms of competition and other players. So, why don't we come back to you, Leah, just thinking about the big picture on cement.
Yeah, there are a lot of green cement companies being spun out in the past 2 years, especially as the problem's gotten more attention. I think just kind of like how renewable energy is different all around the world, whether it's a wind turbine or a solar panel. I think that all of these new innovations will have adoptions that are particularly suited to different regions, different starting materials, different use cases for cement. I think right now, ordinary Portland cement is made in these big fossil fuel fired kilns at thousands of degrees Celsius. I think, there'll be different types of cement for different applications, and it will no longer be a one size fits all solution.
Kevin, I want to come to thanks for that, Leah. I think it's such the necessity of the material, right, and the process, or the output rather, to me is such an inevitable pressure point. And I'm going to come back to that big picture for the 3V in a second. Kevin, I wanted to ask you to your own perspective in terms of Unspun, but just supply chain broadly. You alluded to the ships waiting in the port in LA, right? I think COVID has really really turned up that let's say awareness, certainly that you're seeing yourself. What does that macro long-term decarbonized supply chain look like in the industry you're in, and for you specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alex nailed it. Like scientifically, in so many ways, the root of this all is efficiency, right? It's energy efficiency, it's production efficiency, it's time efficiency, it's money efficiency, and that's just ultimately what's going to drive all of these changes. And I think regardless of what industry you look at, it really does follow that like localized, centralized, localized progression. And absolutely, we can't keep playing like Pong back and forth across the Pacific Ocean to get like a cheap T-shirt on the shelf in Topeka, Kansas. Like, there's just no way that's going to work. So, in terms of like competition, like at this point, we need all of the energy we can get in that direction. So much more the believer of the rising tide raises all ships type mentality.
Sure, it went back to the nautical metaphor. I appreciate that. Yeah. So Alex, your perspective, biomimicry is just fascinating to me. As an avid fan of Spider-Man, and potentially it's not the first time you've probably heard that. It's just the case that I'm now all of a sudden, after looking a little bit into your company, I'm thinking, what else is out there that is doing this? That's taking at least the same general pathway to your point, Kevin, to really copy efficiency that has had millions of years of evolutionary, benefit of coming in terms of its manifestation as we see it today. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about specifically how you see your space in the next 15-ish years, but big picture wise when it comes to biomimicry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when it comes to materials and particularly textiles, it's, as Kevin said, we need all hands on deck. We need different options for different use cases. The kind of material we make can't replace every single type of textile that exists right now. We can obviously produce a wide variety of different types of materials. Even amongst our fibers, we can change how stretchy they are or the shape of them. We can make other types of materials such as films and sponges, but there's always going to be the need for different materials for particular use cases. Even the industry as it stands today, there's not one material that completely is used in every single use case. So I think the more, the merrier, for sure. And I'm hoping that the biomimicry aspect and really understanding the energy efficiency and the processes that allow for more energy efficient ways of producing materials that are based on that kind of copying of nature, I hope those will become more prevalent. Because I feel there was a general sense a few decades ago that actually we could improve upon nature. We can just do it better. We can make our synthetic polymers stronger and tougher and better. But then we've seen that actually in some cases the resulting materials have human impacts on health, or they have an environmental aspect impact from microplastics. And maybe there was actually something to the way that nature did it in the first place.
Right. Yeah, it's really making me think about what other biomimicry opportunities we've already done well or they're yet to be done in exactly that vein. The ping-ponging across the Pacific, I appreciate the visual there, Kevin, because it made me think about the nature of the dynamic of, let's say, government signal or regulatory signal or international signal and its interaction with different marketplaces, different sectors. It is the case. I think we can all accept the premise here at this Climate Tech Summit that the commons is what's at risk, right? The public sort of climate change is not a problem, if you will, that respects borders. So, not to necessarily put you all on the spot in terms of commentary on the current infrastructure bill or anything of that nature, but certainly as leaders of your companies, you're thinking about signal, right? You're thinking about parameters in your marketplaces, et cetera. It could be funding from a research standpoint. It could be different regulatory particulars. And my prompt here is just to ask, how do you approach thinking about that? Right? Is there a daily, and is there a worry? Is there a concern? Is it an opportunity standpoint? I'm certain it's going to be different for all of you. And I think it would be, beneficial for folks listening to hear just how you would approach thinking about that in a general sense, let alone the specifics. And because of the nautical metaphor, Kevin, I'm coming back to you to kick us off here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest opportunity is this is a problem that's going to affect everyone. So how do we start with a solution that includes everyone? And what we've seen at Unspun is one of the most universally accepted motivators is local production. It's better for the environment. It's better for the local economy. As long as that technology is distributed equally, it just makes so much sense. And so for us, particularly as we've both looked at the venture world, but also, the federal grants and funding opportunities that continue to exist. A big opportunity is really going to be bringing back manufacturing infrastructure to the United States. And so that's really one where, we really can emphasize that. And any technology company can, as they start looking at, where is there a bipartisan support for a topic? It's certainly that, bringing back manufacturing.
Great. Leah, what's your reflection on the big picture here when it comes to the broader parameters in which your company operates or the sector operates?
Yeah, I think that policy, like clean procurement policy, and especially preventing carbon leaking at the borders, preventing dirty cement from coming into California through China, stuff like that. I think that will be really important in making green cement in the U.S.
Simple enough. And Alex, this is a space I don't expertly know well, but I have to imagine research dollars are really relevant and thinking about innovation from that standpoint. In addition to some other things, just wondering if you would comment yourself on your approach and your thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I agree with what Leah was saying, and Kevin. This is a global challenge. We can't continue effectively offsetting all of the costs of what we take for granted in the West in terms of manufacturing to other countries and effectively decarbonizing ourselves, but at the cost of another country, out of sight, out of mind. And I think that really feeds into the kind of idea of bringing back more localized possibilities, more decentralized manufacturing, which I think will definitely be the future. But as you say, there does need to be funding put into this, particularly in countries where the manufacturing history is in the past, such as my own. The UK, for example, it does not have the manufacturing that it had 200 years ago. Things have changed. So if we want to make things here again, we have to put money into the infrastructure, we need to put money into the ecosystems, and that has to come from multiple sources. It can't just be governmental source, it has to come from private investments as well. It's really, everyone needs to be pitching in on this. And this is definitely something that we're very aware of.
What's interesting about this conversation, and you all are deeply thoughtful based on the backgrounds you come from a science and the innovation side of your businesses. You're all subject matter experts. But when it comes to making stuff, the geopolitical and global thought process is fundamentally different than if your entire business is operating on data centers in the cloud, right? And I think that's extra clear for me from this conversation, and I think worth calling out in terms of the thought that needs to happen in spaces like this, whether it's your companies or folks that are adjacent or playing in these spaces. So really appreciate the perspectives here. We have just a few minutes left, so I thought I'd end on a basic and simple question that's personal too. It's something I'm sure many people think differently who are maybe listening to this call, but and the three of you might have different answers here as well. And the ages of your companies are different as well. What would you tell your younger self before getting the idea to start this endeavor that you started? What advice would you have on how you got to this point? Maybe it's a high five, great job, or maybe it's something a little bit more complex. Would love to just hear some reflections from the three of you. Whichever one wants to jump in first.
I'll go first. I'd say don't beat yourself up over things that could have been done slightly differently or could have been done slightly better, or some mistakes you made along the way. It's a learning journey. I think no matter what stage or background you have, there's always going to be something that you're going to have to learn. And the journey's different for everyone. So the experiences of one person may not directly parallel your own. That's okay. You know, it's fine to kind of find your way by yourself and not always know exactly where you're going at each point, because if you keep pushing, eventually you'll get there.
Lovely.
Yeah, I think I would tell my former self that, you know, this journey is very exciting, very motivating, but equal parts scary. You're on a really fast learning curve. So all in all, it's a great adventure. One part fear and one part excitement. Yeah.
Both get the adrenaline going. Yeah, Kevin, why don't you round us out here?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that's different, you know, thinking about like then being in the driver's seat versus now in the rearview mirror is like you know, starting a company, you're always like there's a goal, there's always a destination, you're always trying to get somewhere. And after a while, you know, you start to reflect, you're like, oh wow, like the last few years have been like an incredible journey. So I think the biggest thing would actually be less tactical or less strategic. It would more just be like those little things where like, oh, I just need to like get through this phase. Like at some point you're going to look back at it and be like, wow, that was so cool. And we were all just like sitting in, you know, my co-founder's dining room working together. Like that feels like this not significant part of the company. But then later on, you're going to remember that and be like, wow, that was like such a formative moment. So yeah, I guess just enjoying the ride on the way to the destination.
I really appreciate everyone who was here on this panel, the three of you, as well as everyone listening in. You know, I partially have spent a lot of my professional career on these issues, you know, feigning the scientific expertise in the policy arena and being really worried about all the things that are on the horizon. But this is truly a hopeful conversation. I think the three of you are doing some incredible work to get us to where we need to be. And I just want to thank you all for the time you're spending on what you're doing and for the time spent here today. And with that wraps up our session, and happy to hand it back over to SOSV and Gwen.